Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this crash course, we are going to explore Prisma. Now, I am over here at the Prisma.io landing page, and it says that Prisma is a next generation ORM. Now, what is an ORM? Well, an ORM is an object relational mapper. And essentially what it does is it really simplifies the way that we are going to query and mutate data. And it does that because it allows us to mutate and query data in an object-oriented paradigm. So let me kind of explain what I mean by that through this example over here. So this is a really good example. So let's say over here we have a table. So this is a table of users. So you can see here we have an ID, first name, email, and active. And let's say we want to go ahead and we want to insert data into this particular table. Well, to do that, in typical SQL, we would have to create an insert into statement. So we would have to go ahead and create insert into users table, and we would have to supply it with the first name, the email, and then the active status. Now, in Prisma, we don't have to do that. Through the use of an ORM, it is actually a lot simpler. So over here, they actually kind of have an example of how this is going to be done through an ORM like Prisma. So over here, we're going to create a new record. You can see here it's going to be prisma.users.create, and then over here, data, first name, last name, and then their email as well. And then go ahead, once this is executed, we go ahead and we find it. Now, same thing with finding records. Instead of having select star from whatever, you can go ahead and do something like user.findMany, and you can go ahead and have your kind of conditional over here, and there we go, you find it. And that really kind of simplifies the process. Really, all it is trying to do is just making dealing with our database a lot easier. So instead of using kind of complex SQL statements, we would use a more object-oriented paradigm that most programmers are already comfortable with through the use of an ORM like Prisma. Now, Prisma is a very special ORM because it does a lot of different things. So let's actually kind of explore what it does. So this is one thing that it does. Another thing that it does is it allows us to model our data very, very easily. So instead of, creating complex create tables and kind of relating tables together manually through foreign keys, Prisma makes that really, really easy. All you have to do is go ahead and create something like this. You will have to, this does kind of look very similar to SQL, but there is a little bit different. So over here we have an integer. Over here we are defining the type. We're defining that it's an ID. But you can see here the true power of this is how we can actually relate data together. You can see here that over here an author is related to the user. And you can see here, this is how we define a relationship between the two. And it's really, really a lot simpler and a lot cleaner than actually doing that manually through a SQL create table statement. So that is one thing that we can do. And there's actually many, many different things that that Prisma can do. For instance, it allows us to migrate our schema to our database very easily. It also allows us to introspect our data into this schema over here. So if we already have a predefined schema inside of our table, we can actually introspect that and put it into the Prisma schema. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry, we're going to look into that in a lot of detail. And another thing that I really, really like about Prisma is that it allows us to actually visualize our data. And this is kind of a feature that I haven't seen with any ORM. So Prisma actually provides us with a GUI known as Prisma Studio, and we can actually go ahead and visualize our data through that GUI. And we can actually go ahead and also insert and create an update, which is really, really cool and can come really, really handy. Now, as you can see here, there are supported languages, so it really only supports TypeScript and JavaScript and TypeScript and Go. Go is in early access, and these are the databases that it supports. So it really only supports SQL databases. So we have MySQL, Postgres, and SQLite. We are going to be using MySQL for this crash course, just because it's a lot easier to get running on your local machine. But the concepts that you learn here are going to translate very easily to Postgres as well as SQLite if you want to use these databases. Alright, so that is pretty much that. If you want to learn more about Prisma, we'll continue watching this crash course, and go ahead and read this documentation if you want to at prisma.io. It's really, really good. But I'm going to try my best to cover almost everything here. So if you want to learn more about Prisma, we'll continue watching. Enough of the talking. Let's actually go on and set up our Prisma project. Now, to set up our Prisma project, I highly recommend following the docs that they have in prisma.io. So to do that, all you have to do is you have to go to Quick Start right over here. And let me quickly zoom in a little bit just to kind of increase the size of this. So you can see here, there's actually 3 ways you can really get started. You can do a quick start using SQLite, or you can add Prisma to an existing project, or you can start from scratch. Now in us, we are going to start from scratch just so we have a good understanding of how Prisma works. Now as you can see here, there's different technologies that we can use. For instance, right now it supports JavaScript and TypeScript. In this crash course, we are going to be using JavaScript. And the main reason for using JavaScript is because if you know TypeScript, you know JavaScript. But if you know JavaScript, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know TypeScript. So we're just going to do JavaScript just so we have a larger demographic that can actually utilize this video. Now in terms of databases, again, MySQL or Postgres, we are going to be using MySQL just because I found it a lot easier to download this on your local machine. So I'm not going to go over how to download MySQL on your local machine, but if you want to take a look at that, just go to dev.mysql.com/downloads. And what I would need you to do is to download the community server as well as the workbench. And really, they're very, very easy downloads. They're just simply a wizard that you have to follow. So go ahead and download that. And I'll have some links in the description below if you're having trouble downloading. I'll have some tutorials down there as well for you to check out. So there we go. That is pretty much all that we need. So let's go ahead and let's read through this documentation and see how we can set up our Prisma project. So it says here, well, to create a project, the first thing is we have to create a directory. So go ahead and create a directory, call it whatever it is that you want. I already did. I called it Prisma Tut. That was my directory. And then the first thing that you have to do is cd into that directory and initialize a new node project. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So I opened up my directory in Visual Studio Code. That is a code editor of my choosing. Let me just quickly zoom in a little bit here. So I opened up also the integrated terminal that you can of course do that through, well, this command right over here. And now I'm inside the Prisma Tut directory. So now all I have to do is initialize a node project. So I can do npm init-y, and that should generate our package.json file right over here. Cool, so we have just generated that. So what is the next step? Well, the next step is to install Prisma. So let's go ahead and install Prisma. So there we go. Let's give that a little bit of time. And this right here is going to install the Prisma CLI. So now we can actually use this command to initialize a Prisma project. So to do that, we would do something like npx Prisma. So this is how we access our CLI. Now if we want to do something specific like initialize a Prisma project, now what we would do is npx Prisma and then init. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And there we go. You can see here that, well, we have a bunch of different folders and files. So you can see here that we have this new Prisma directory. And in this Prisma directory, we have this weird prisma.schema. Now, if you open this up, this might all be white for you. So, you know, the syntax highlighting might not be all too great. The reason why it's nice for me is because, well, I'm using a VS Code extension known as Prisma, and this was actually created by Prisma. So if you want to have that nice syntax highlighting, go ahead and install this VS Code extension. So we get this prisma.schema file, and we'll get to this a little bit later. Don't worry all too much about this. So there we go. Now we have pretty much created our Prisma project. Now the next step is actually to connect it to our database. Now as you can see here in the prisma.schema, we have our database right over here, and by default it has Postgres. Now feel free to use Postgres if you have that, have a Postgres instance locally in your machine, or you have a Postgres database in AWS for safe. Go ahead, feel free. But again, we are going to be using MySQL. Now over here, we need to also supply it with the database URL. Now the database URL is inside of an environment variable, so it's going to be inside of this env file. And it's going to look a little something like this right over here. And actually, to get a better understanding of how the structure is going to be, we can actually just copy this. So copy this URL, because this is going to be a MySQL URL. So we can copy that. And you can see here, it's going to be MySQL. And over here, it is going to be the username. Now, what is the username? Well, if you have a local instance of MySQL running, for me, it is going to be root. So you can see that over here. I hope that I can't really increase the size in the MySQL workbench, but over here you can see that it is root for me. So you can kind of check that out. So over here you can say root, and then over here, well, whatever password is. In my case, my password is simply password, and then everything else you can literally leave the same except for the database. You can change the database to something else. I'm going to change it to Prisma. Now let's go ahead and save this, and let's save that. And let me go ahead and open this up, and I'm gonna have to actually write my password, which is password. And you can see here, now I am in a quick second, I am actually in Workbench. So I actually have, if I go to now Schema, again, I apologize if this is a little small. I really don't know how to increase the size in Workbench, but we're not going to be working with Workbench at all. So I actually have a Prisma, a predefined Prisma table. So I'm just going to quickly go ahead and just drop this table. So you can do that through a simple command like drop table Prisma. Now you probably are not going to have that, so I'm going to drop it, and it doesn't seem like it's working for some reason. Drop table Prisma. Why is that giving me an error? No database. Oh, sorry. I don't want to drop the table Prisma. I want to drop the database Prisma. There we go. And that should work perfectly fine. Now what I'm going to do now is actually create the database again. So I'm going to create that database because we are defining that specific database. Now the reason why I dropped it is because I wanted to show you how to create a database, plus I also had some other stuff in there as well. So to actually go ahead and see it, all you have to do is just right click, refresh, and you can see a brand new database instance. So again, apologies if this is way too small. I really don't know how to zoom in here, but we're not going to be working with Workbench at all actually, so we don't have to worry about that. So now essentially what we can basically do is put that inside of our environment variable, and now we are actually able to connect to our Prisma or our SQL database. So that is really all we have to do for connections. So that is it for this section, and we'll see you in the next one. So now that we have set up our Prisma project, the next step is to tell Prisma how our data is going to look like inside of our database. And we do that through Schema Definitions. If we go back to this over here, you can see here that we can actually create Schema Definitions in that schema.prisma file. So you can see here in this example, we have a post, and this kind of represents a table. We have profile, and then we have users. So that is basically what we are going to do. Now, before we are able to do this, we need to have an understanding of how the data is going to be organized inside of our database. Now, for this crash course, we are going to create a very, very extremely simple application. This is really an application based on how we can work with Prisma. I don't want to build something very sophisticated. So essentially over here, we're going to have a table that is going to be comprised of the ID, which is a primary key, and the username, that is a varchar. And this is simply the users table. This is just going to be the users table. And we're not even going to store a password because I'm not going to be dealing with authentication. Again, because I want to deal with Prisma. If you want to learn about authentication, I do have an authentication crash course that you can actually use in conjunction with Prisma. I'll actually link that in the description. So really, all we have is an ID and the username. And this over here is another table, and over here this table is related to posts. So this table is related to posts. So I can go ahead here and just change this to posts, and this contains an ID, this contains a title, a post, a created at, an updated at field, as well as a user ID that is an integer. And this is going to be a foreign key that links a post to a particular user. And that way we can actually have a one-to-many relationship. And I will show you guys how to do that all in Prisma well, in the next few coming lectures. So let's actually go about doing that right now. And for simplicity's sake, for actually introducing how we work with schema, let's just create this over here. So we're just going to create this. We're not going to have any sort of relationship. We're just going to create the users right over here. And I think this is going to really explain to you how we can go ahead and create our schema and kind of migrate that to our database table. All right, so let's go about doing that right now. So remember, to do that, we have to do that inside of our schema.prisma file. So remember, that's going to be in our Prisma directory. And in here, we have schema.prisma. And this is where we're going to define our schema. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to define a brand new table in our database. And we do that in Prisma through model. So we do model, and then we define the name of our table. Now, typically, a model is going to have a uppercase letter right over here inside of the schema.prisma file. So we're going to have model user, and then we have basically a bunch of curly brackets, and in here we're going to define the columns and their associated types. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to provide it with an ID. So, well, we say ID. The next thing that we want to do is we want to provide it with the type. And so in this case, well, this ID is going to be an integer. So it's going to be a number. Now you can see here, we're getting a bunch of errors. And the reason for this is it's saying, hey, each model must have at least one unique criteria that has only required fields. So essentially, it wants us to either mark it as an ID or as a unique ID. And that's basically what is happening here. So we have to actually go ahead and use the @ID decorator to say that, hey, this is basically a primary key. So now this is an ID. However, what we want to do is we want to auto-generate this ID. We don't want to provide this ID in. So what we can do is we can actually default this using the @default decorator. So we can default it, and we can default it to auto increment. So auto increment. So essentially now what happens is well, when you add a user, it instantiates it as 1, and then if you add another user, it auto increments it to 2. And that way we have a unique ID. So with Prisma, we're going to be dealing with a lot of these decorators, and there's a lot of different decorators. For instance, there's the @unique decorator. If we want to ensure that, hey, something is absolutely unique, well, we are going to use that specific decorator. Now, this one is going to be an ID because I want to specify that this is a primary key. So that is the very first thing. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add, well, a username. And the username is going to be a string. So this is going to be the username. And behind the scenes, what this is going to do is it's going to convert it to a varchar. Now, you know, when creating a varchar, you can actually specify the number of characters that you want, and typically it's 255. With Prisma, what it does usually is it has some weird value. It instantiates it at like 190. I don't really like that. So we can actually change that by accessing the @db decorator, and then we just do .varchar. And then over here we can say, well, 255. So there we go. That is pretty much that. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that the username is unique across this user's table. So over here I can go ahead and add the @unique decorator, and now this basically ensures that, hey, this is going to be unique. And we'll actually look at the SQL that kind of gets created kind of behind the scenes in a little bit, but this is going to add a unique constraint. So there is a bunch of decorators. I actually highly recommend you go ahead and kind of just look into them. You have the @unique, we have the @map, we have @relationship. We're going to pretty much look at every single one over here, don't worry, throughout this crash course. But this is really how we perform actions inside of our schema.prisma file. This is how we go ahead and define our tables. So let's go ahead and let's do this. And that is pretty much that. Now, how do I get this inside of my database? So remember, my database is right here. It is in this local MySQL instance. For you, it could be Postgres or MySQL, or it could even be in the cloud. How do I get this new table inside of my database? Well, we do this through migrations, and I'll talk about how to perform migrations in the next section. Now that we have defined our schema inside of our schema.prisma file, the next step is to actually migrate that into our database. So, well, we do that with migrations. And to actually migrate our data, we are going to use the Prisma CLI. And we're going to use a specific command right over here. So we're going to do npx prisma migrate dev --name init. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to look at our schema inside of this file and then essentially translate that to our database. So you can see here this command does two things. It's going to create a new SQL migration file for this migration, and we will see that in a bit. And then it's going to run that SQL migration file against the database. And so we can actually see what the SQL commands that are run inside of our database through this file. So let's go ahead and let's copy this right over here. And let's just paste this inside of our terminal. So let's go ahead and let's just paste that. And let's give it a quick second. And there we go. Okay, so it seems like it has completely worked. And you can see here we now have a new migrations directory inside of the Prisma directory. And if we go here, we also have this weird number, and this is just a timestamp. And we can see here we have a migration.sql. If we open this up, you can see that the SQL that was created. So we can see here that we have created a create table, and essentially the ID is a integer, not null, auto increment. So this is just a primary key. And over here we have a username that is going to be a varchar, also not null. And you can see here that it also created an index for our username because we defined it as unique. So it said, hey, might as well go ahead and create an index. And if you don't know anything about indexes, don't worry. I do have a crash course on that. I can also link that in the description. You do not really have to worry about that, but this is kind of an extra neat feature that it does. And over here, it also defines that this is a primary key. Our ID is a primary key. And then over here, we have just a bunch of extra things that we don't have to worry about. But this is great. This is what it was able to execute based on our very simple instruction right over here. So this is all that we have defined, and this is all that it has executed. And you can see here how much more helpful Prisma can be because we don't have to go ahead and create all these complex things. Rather, all we have to do is define this right over here, which is a lot simpler. All right. So let us move on now. So now that we have actually migrated it, the first thing, of course, that it did was create that migration. The next thing that it is going to do is, well, actually run that migration on our database. So let's actually check that out right now. So inside of our database, again, this apologies, this might be a little bit small for you, but go to your database and go to your Prisma directory right over here. And if you go to tables, what you can do is you can go ahead and right click, and then you can just refresh the tables, and you can see now you have a users table. So you have a users table. So if I go ahead and I do something like use Prisma, so I want to use the Prisma database, and I execute this. All right, and now let's do something like select star from users. So select star from user. I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And you can see here that I actually get a table. Again, apologies if this is very small. I really don't know how to zoom things in, but you can take my word for it that we have a column of ID and a username that is a varchar. So we can see that in there right now, which is, well, this is pretty terrific. So we can see here that it actually migrated our data. Now, one thing is that I really don't like capital cases inside of our SQL database. So one thing to change that, we can actually go ahead in our schema and we can change that by saying at map. And essentially here we can say that we want the name, I'm sorry, this is going to be an object, and we're going to say that we want the name to be, well, user. And apologies, this actually is not going to be an object. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of that. We want the name to be a user. Now, if we want to run this command and actually get it inside of our database, what we can do is we can go ahead and run that same exact migration. So we go ahead, we run that migration, and now we get another file right over here. This is another timestamp, and you can see here that it's a little bit simpler. So over here we have they dropped the user table, and they went ahead and created the user table with basically this over here. So with capital case U instead of uppercase U. So now if I go back to this over here, what I can actually do now is, again, let's do a quick refresh. So I'm going to refresh, and you can see here again, apologies if everything is small, but basically if I change this now to, or if I leave this as capital U and I execute this, essentially I guess it works still the same in a SQL, but in Postgres it is more case sensitive. But yeah, you can either you can try to see it, or you take my word for it that the name is now lowercase. So that is basically all that we have to do, and whenever we make any change that we want actually reflected inside of our database, we have to run that migration command. So that is pretty much that. So far, we have learned how to migrate data from our Prisma schema into our database. And it kind of looks a little something like this. So we have all of our definitions over here, and then through the Prisma CLI, we run that migrate command, and it migrates all that information into our SQL database. But that pretty much assumes that our Prisma schema is the only source of truth, and that our SQL database is kind of out of date. Now, what happens if we run into a different scenario where actually our MySQL database is more in date than the Prisma schema? For instance, what if we have created an additional table in our database that we haven't defined in our schema? Now, one thing that we could possibly do is just go ahead and manually add that in our Prisma schema, but a better option is to use something known as introspection. And essentially what introspection does is it allows Prisma to go into the database, read all of the tables, read all of the columns, and then see how that relates to the schema that already exists. Now, if there are any changes, it goes ahead and it changes them. Let's actually take a look at how it does that. So I'm going to go to Workbench, and I'm just going to quickly create this test table that we will eventually drop. So I'm going to quickly create it, and there we go. So now we have a test table. So if I go ahead and refresh this, again, you might have to take my word for it, but it created a test table. So now what we can do is, instead of going into our Prisma.schema and creating a new model, we can actually use the Prisma CLI to interpret our table, our database tables, and actually create the appropriate schema. And to do that, we would use something known, again, as introspection. And this right here is the command that we will run. npx prisma introspect -- force. So let us go ahead and let's run this command. And you can get this from this over here, prisma.io docs concepts, components, introspection, or you can just go ahead and just search Prisma introspection to get the folder or the web page. So let's go ahead and let's paste that in there. And okay, and there we go. Okay, there seems to have been a change. And there we go. You can see that our thing got completely changed. So over here we have an ID, which basically an ID int, and over here with the decorator that is an ID, and that basically translates to the primary key that we created. And over here I created an active column that is a boolean, and I also said that this was nullable, because remember, in SQL we specify things that are nullable, that are not nullable through the not null constraint. And you can see here that it has actually created active, and it said that this is a boolean, but this is optional. And this is how we define things, whether they're nullable or not. We have this question mark over here. So that is pretty much that, which is terrific. Now I don't want this table. So now what I can actually do is either delete it in our actual database and in our schema, or I can just simply delete this in our schema and just run the migrate command. So we can go ahead and run this command. and give it a quick second. So it's going to say here, hey, there's something wrong here. Or there's nothing wrong. It says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? We're probably going to be end up deleting a table with some data. I'm going to say it's fine. There's no data in it anyways. And you can see here, we get a new migration. And you can see that this migration, let's quickly go over here. This migration has not dropped it. Oh, and the reason why it hasn't dropped anything is because I didn't save it. Apologies. Let's go ahead and let's do this migration again. Okay, so now we get another migration, and you can see here that all it did is just dropped that table. So that is how we pretty much relate data, or how we can move data from our database to Prisma, and then from Prisma to our database. So that is all we really have to worry about. In the next section, we're going to create the post model, and then we are going to essentially define how we can relate data together through our schema. Alright, so we have created our users table. Let's go ahead and create our posts table. Now remember how our data is going to look like. So we have completely created this, but now we have to create this table. And we also have to find some way to relate many posts to a particular user. Because over here, we're going to have a one-to-many relationship. So let's actually go about doing that right about now. So let's go to our schema. And of course, what we are going to do is we are going to have a model. So we're going to have a model. Now, because of the introspection, it changed it to a lowercase user. But essentially, I like having the models be capital case, but I also do like inside of our database for the table names to be lowercase, so we can just simply use the @ map. So over here, now what we can do is we can essentially create our post, and over here we can similarly have the @ map and basically say that, hey, the name of this table is just lowercase post. Alright, so what is the next step? Well, the next step is going to be very similar to what we have over here. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to define our ID. This is going to be an integer, and we're going to have a few decorators in here. So the first decorator is going to be the @ID decorator to define that, hey, this is going to be a primary key. And then we're going to have an @default, and then we're going to have an increment. So there we go. That is the absolute first thing. The next thing we need is the title and then the post. So we can go ahead and do that right now. We can say that the title is going to be a string. And then we can also say that the post is similarly also going to be a string. We also probably want to increase the limit of this. So essentially what we can do here is we can do @db. So we can say @db, and then we can say .varchar. And essentially maybe we can say that a post can only be, let's say 500 characters. So we can do that. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to have these two fields, the created @ field and the updated @ field. So let's do that right now. So we have the created @ field, and this is going to be of type datetime. So this is of type datetime. Now, if you never know the type of a certain thing, you can probably guess it most of the time, especially if you have been working with types, or you can just go ahead and just search it up on the Prisma.io page. So there we go. So we also want to default that to when this post was created. So we can actually have the @default decorator, and then we can basically say now. So this is basically whenever this is created, I want to run this function right over here. Okay, so let's also do the updated @. This is also going to be date time. And then we are going to have a special decorator for this. It's going to be called update@dat. So whenever this post is updated at, essentially it just changes the date time accordingly. Now the absolute last thing that we need to do is add this user ID over here and relate it to this user. So how do we do that? Well, you might think, okay, that is relatively simple. You would just have a user ID, and we can say that this is an integer. Now, we also have to somehow define that this is going to be a foreign key that basically relates to this model right over here. Now, to do that, we're going to create a separate column known as user, and we're going to define that as the type user. So this particular model over here. So we're going to say that, hey, this is going to relate to one user. And then we're going to use the @relation decorator. And then this is going to take in two parameters. So the first parameter is the fields. And this is basically the fields within the model that we are creating. So essentially over here, this is the fields within the model that we're creating. And essentially we're going to pick a column that we're going to use to relate to this table right over here. So we're going to use our user ID column. So over here we can say user ID. And then what we are going to do is we're going to have another parameter, and we're going to say that, hey, this references, so this references another array, and this is going to reference a specific column in the type that we have defined over here. So whatever model that we have defined over here, we're going to pick a particular column. Now in this case, we're going to pick the ID, and then over here we can basically just say ID, and then at that point we are pretty much done. That is pretty much it. Now the only problem is we also have to do the same thing over here. So over here, what we have to do is we have to say that, hey, we have posts, and that relates to, well, this model over here, which is going to be the posts. And of course we don't have a colon, and it's actually going to be an array because we have a one-to-many relationship. So that is pretty much all that we have to do. For some reason, I am getting some sort of syntax errors. Let me see here. Let me quickly highlight over this. So we have references is, oh, sorry, this should be references, not reference. So there we go. That is pretty much all that we have to do. Let me quickly just zoom out of this so you have kind of an idea of everything that we have here. So basically what we are doing here is we are defining user, and we're saying that, hey, this is always going to be just one user. And over here, we're defining the relationship. And essentially, we're saying here, the fields is going to be the columns within the post. And then we're going to say that, hey, we want to relate our user ID, and we want to refer that to the ID inside of the user column. Now, over here, we can basically say that, hey, we have multiple posts that are essentially of this particular type, and we can have many of them. So that way we have a one-to-many relationship and a many-to-one relationship. So that is pretty much all we really have to do. If you don't really understand this, this is kind of basic SQL. So if the SQL part of this is a little bit confusing, I will in the future have a SQL crash course, and I can probably link that in the description as well. But this is just a basic way of creating foreign keys inside of a Prisma schema. And let's actually take a look at that by migrating it. So let's go ahead, migrate this, and we should see a new migration. And we should be able to see our table. So over here, you can see here we created our post table, and we see here we have an ID, we have a title, we have a post, and then we have this right here. This is the user ID, and it is an integer, not null, and of course this is a primary key. But over here you can see we have the foreign key constraint right over here. So this is actually a foreign key that references the ID in the user table, and also adds some other things on delete cascade, on update cascade, which is actually really ideal. We probably want that anyways. So that is pretty much that. So we have actually learned how to relate data together inside of a Prisma schema. So now let's actually go ahead and use this schema to fetch our data, manipulate our data, delete our data, and things of that nature. And we're going to do that in the next section. So far, the only way to actually see our database is to open up Workbench and see it in our actual database instance. But Prisma actually has this really cool GUI that allows us to much better visualize our data. And this is known as Prisma Studio. So to open this up, what we can actually do is go to our terminal. I'm going to open up a new terminal. And what we can do is, using the Prisma CLI, we can do npx prisma and then studio. And then we can go ahead and execute this. And now it is running on localhost 5555. And you can see here are our models. So we have our user model, we have our post model, and these are all the models that we have defined right over here. Now if we go ahead and we click on it, you can see here all of our columns. Now right now there actually isn't any records inside of our database, which makes complete sense, but we can actually go ahead and actually add records if we wanted to. So you can see here that this is auto incremented, but we can also say that, hey, we have a username of, well, Lath Harp, for instance, and we can go ahead and save these changes, and let's quickly refresh so we can actually see those changes. Sorry, this is null for some reason. Let's go ahead and let's change that, and let's add that particular record. Okay, I'm not really sure what's going on here. Let's quickly delete this record, and there we go. Now we have this record over here. So we can actually see that, and we can save that change, and then we can go here, and we can also see all of our posts as well. So this is a really cool way for us to actually visualize and see our data. So if you want to do that, we will continuously use this GUI in the future sections, but if you actually want to be able to visualize and see it, then go ahead and run it on local 5555. So the last thing that we actually have to do is to create our REST API and use Prisma as the ORM. Now to do that, we are going to use Prisma Client. And if you go back to the docs, the start from scratch docs, the last thing that we really have to do is install this Prisma Client. And essentially, once we install this Prisma Client, it is going to create a bunch of directories inside of the Node modules, which makes sense. And also, once we install it, it's going to run this command, Prisma generate. Now, essentially, this is going to cause the Prisma CLI to read and interpret our schema in line 3 and 4, and then it is going to go ahead and update our Prisma client inside of our Node modules. So as soon as we install it, it is going to run the Prisma generate command. However, once we install it and then we make any sort of subsequent changes, we have to run the Prisma generate to go through this workflow over here. So for it to read our schema and make any sort of updates in the Node modules. So let's go about doing that right now. So let us install that, and I'm going to install that in the first directory. So we're going to go ahead and install the Prisma client. So we're going to install the Prisma client. There we go. And now we want to go ahead and create our API. So let's go ahead and let's create an index.js file in the root directory. This is going to be an index.js file. Now this basically, it's all in caps. So this over here can be any API that we have created. If we go back to the docs, we can go over here. We can basically see the different types of APIs or Node frameworks that essentially it supports. So you can see here that it supports Express, it also supports Apollo, it also supports GraphQL, it supports Nest. For our example, we are going to use Express. So we're going to use Express. If you don't have any knowledge of Express, that is okay. It is just a simple way of creating a REST API. And I do expect you to have knowledge of a REST API if you are taking this crash course. So we're going to use Express. So to do that, well, really all we have to do is just install Express. And let's give that a quick second. And over here, once this installs, we are going to, inside of our index.js, create our Express project. So let's go ahead and let's just do const express, and we're going to require that in from Express. And then what we're going to do, we're going to instantiate an Express instance, and this is going to be called app. And then we are going to simply do an app.listen. And we are going to listen on port 5000. And we are going to console.log listening on port 5000. So very, very simple. Now just to quickly test it out, let's create a get route that just goes to the root directory. And let's do a rec res. And essentially let's go ahead and basically send back I am working. So let us go ahead, and inside of here what we can now do is node index.js. Now, I'm not going to do node, and the reason for that is if I make any change, I have to go ahead and restart the server every single time. And that can get really, really annoying. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use something known as nodemon index.js. And essentially what this does is it catches any changes and it updates the server automatically without me having to shut it off and run it back. Now, if you don't have nodemon installed, what you could do is just do something like npm install nodemon and with the -g flag, so you can install it globally on your machine. Now, if you are on Mac and Linux, you will probably have to have the sudo right over here so that essentially you can do it in administrative mode and supply your password. Now, I already have it installed, so I'm going to go ahead and use nodemon. Now, you could use node, but beware that whenever you make a change, you have to restart your server. So I'm going to use nodemon and go ahead and run this. And you can see here listening on port 5000. And now if I change this to an exclamation mark, you can see here that it automatically changes it. Whereas with node, I would have to restart it. So let's just quickly test this out. Let's go to localhost 5000. And you can see here that it is working. Okay, cool. So for this particular application, we are going to use Postman. So let's go ahead and let's open up Postman. See where I have that in there. You can see my messy desktop. Apologies for that. Let's open up Postman. Let's just wait a little bit. I'm not sure why this is taking so long. Anyways, I'll open up Postman a little bit later, but we're going to basically use Postman to test our routes. So let's go ahead and let's actually start creating our routes in the next section. Let's actually start using the Prisma client inside of our routes that we are going to create. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create 2 routes for the user. We're going to create a route where we can get all of the users and their associated posts. And then we're also going to create a route that allows us to, well, create a user. And we're going to do this through the Prisma client. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So inside of this directory, let's actually create a new folder called routes. So this is going to be called routes. And in here, we're going to house all of the routes associated to our application. Now in here, I'm going to have a user.js file, and this is going to contain all of the routes that are associated to users. So we're going to have our get all users route in here, and then we're also going to have our create user route in here as well. So to do this, this is just simple express. So we're going to do const router, and we're going to get that from express. So we're going to require in express and then .router. So this essentially is what we are going to use to create our routes. So now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and create get requests or post requests or delete requests. Now the one thing that we actually have to do is at the very bottom, we actually have to export this because we need to get this router inside of our index.js file, because this is ultimately what we're running. So we want to basically import all our logic into here. So now what we can do is we can do modules.export, and we can export our router. And to essentially get it inside of our index.js file, all we now have to do is use it as a middleware. So we can essentially now do app.use, and we can define a predefined path as the first parameter. So any path that is /API/user that starts with this, I want you to direct it to, well, we're going to require in the router from the users. So the routes from the users. So that is essentially what we are going to do. One last thing that we have to do is to be able to access data from the rec.body, we have to use app.use express JSON. So this is just basic Express setup. If you don't really know Express, this is okay. All you have to understand is how a REST API is done. This is just a little bit of setup. So in here, now we can actually create our endpoints. So let's create our first endpoint. to get all of our users. Now remember, if we go to our GUI, at this point we have one user inside of our database. So we should actually get this user right over here. And this user right now has 0 posts associated with them, but we should still get an empty array of posts. So let us go ahead and let's do router.get, and this is going to be just the slash, and then we're going to have here the rec res. So rec res, and now what we want to do is we want to access all of the users inside of our database. Now how do we do that? Well, we do that through the Prisma client. So now what we can do is we can use that client that we actually installed. So we can go ahead and require that in. So this is at Prisma Client, and we can essentially get the Prisma client from that. And then what we can do is for each model that we have created, the client is going to create a particular object that we're able to use to interact with our database. So now to actually access those, what we can do is we can basically say new client, we can instantiate this client, and we can say that, hey, I want the user object. Now there's also going to be a post object right over here. Now there's not going to be anything else, but if we create models, essentially what happens is once we run our generate command, this actually gets manipulated inside of the node modules right over here. So now we can actually get the users, we can also get the posts. If we have comments, we would be able to get comments, but we don't have them at the moment. So we can basically say user. And now what we can basically do is we can get all of our users. So we can say something like let or const users is equal to user dot find. So you can see here, find the first iteration, find many, or find unique. This is kind of like find one or find by ID. We're going to want to find many of them. So we're going to go ahead and find many of them. And essentially what we want to ultimately do is find them all. So essentially what we can basically say is, hey, we want you to find them all, no conditions. However, let's say we don't want certain parameters. So let's say we only want, we don't want you to give us back the ID. Let's say we only want the username and the posts. So remember here, we have ID, username, and posts. So to do that in typical SQL, we would do something like select username from this table rather than select star from table. Well, we can essentially add a selector right in here. And we can basically say that, hey, we want to select, and then we pick what we want to select. So over here, we can say that, hey, we want to select the username. And you can see here how cool this is. It kind of auto fills for us. And we can say true. And then we can say that, hey, we also want to select all of the posts. And we can say true for that. Now, if we also wanted to filter, what we could possibly do is have a where. So we can have a where, and we can basically say, hey, where maybe the username is, you know, this or whatever, or maybe if we had an active column, we can say where the active is false, or maybe you would probably want to query for where the active is true. So we could possibly do that as well. So that is how we are going to filter. We'll talk about filtering a little bit later. It is fine, but for now, we'll just have the select. Now this is going to be asynchronous because we are communicating with our database. So to kind of fix this issue, we have to just mark this as an async function and also mark this as await. So that is pretty much all we really need to do. Now we have gotten all of our users. So now essentially what we can do is a res.json, and we can go ahead and just return all of those users. So if we go to Postman now, I have a Prisma directory. And now what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and just create a request. I'm going to call this request get users. All right, so I'm going to call this request get users. And I'm going to just quickly go to localhost 5,000. I'm just going to copy and paste this URL. So I'm going to copy and paste this URL over here. So now if we go to localhost 5,000/API/users and then / and make sure that this is a get route, we should get all of our users. So you get /API/users, and we go ahead and send this off. well, this doesn't work for some reason. Let's see, am I missing something here? Okay, because I have user. So let's go ahead and change this up again. And there we go. Let me quickly zoom in a little bit. You can see here that we get our data back, which is terrific. Now, let's say I only wanted, let's say I didn't want the posts. Just to kind of quickly illustrate this. If I don't want the posts, I just wouldn't have this in there. So now if I were to make this request again, you can see here, I can actually specifically select for the people that I want. Let's also have a where clause in here. Let's add a where clause. And this where clause is going to be, let's say, where the username, for some reason, I'm not filtering by ID for some reason, where the username is this. Now if I were to execute this, you can see that, hey, none of this meet this condition, so we don't actually get something in our array. Now over here, it doesn't really make sense to have a where clause, and if we wanted to filter by a specific username, might as well use the find unique, which we will see a little bit later in the in future routes. So that is, well, the get route. Let's actually go ahead and create a user now. So let's do router. So right here, right below, we're going to do router, and we're going to call this router.post. And we're going to have the same path because, well, this is a different verb that we're using here. So we're going to do rec-res, and as you can imagine, we're going to have a lot of asynchronicity for this. So we're going to mark this as async. And now what we're going to do is essentially the user, if you want to create an account for this extremely simple application, all you have to do is provide us with a username. Not even a password, you just have to provide us with a username. Again, I don't want to dwell on authentication and all that stuff. I really just want to teach you how we can use Prisma. So this isn't a real application. I highly wouldn't recommend doing this. Again, if you want to actually create proper routes, I do have a great crash course about JWT authentication that I will link in the description. But for now, all you have to do is just provide us with a username that is unique. So you can't provide us with the same username. For instance, you can't go ahead and provide us with, let me quickly save this. You can't go ahead and provide us with Lathe Harp because that is already in use. So to access our username, we're going to say that, hey, this is going to be in the request body. So to access that, we would just do something like const username. We're going to destructure out username from the rec body. And then the first thing that we're going to want to do is basically check if this user already exists. Now, how do we check if this user exists? Well, we can use the find unique command right over here. So we used find many, but we can also use find unique. So we can say const user exists, and we can basically say await dot user, and then we can say dot find unique. So we can find unique. And then over here, we can have a where clause. So essentially we can say where the username is the username that we provided over here. So it would look ultimately something like this. So where the username is the username that we provided over here. Now, because the key and the value are exactly the same in JavaScript, we can just simplify that down to this. And then let's say that we only want to select for, the username itself. So we don't really care for anything else. We just want to select for the username, so we say select true. Okay, so now that we got that, essentially, let's just do a quick res.json, and let's just return back user exists. That's all we want to do, just so we can see how this looks like. So inside of Postman, we can go ahead and we can create another route, and we're going to call this create user. We're going to copy this over here because it's going to be the exact same path, just a different verb. And let me quickly save this and save this as well. And now in the rec.body, I am going to provide it with, what is going on here? I'm going to provide it with raw and then JSON, and I'm going to provide it with a username. So I'm going to provide it with a username, and I'm going to provide it with a username that does already exist. So I'm going to provide it with the Lathe Harp username. So Lathe Harp. So let's go ahead and let's send this off. And you can see here, I get back an object of, well, username lathe harp, basically symbolizing that, hey, this does exist. Now, if this doesn't exist, let's add an extra B in there. You get back null. So now what we can basically do is essentially we can check, hey, if this user exists, so you can say basically if user exists, so if basically this is not null, what we can essentially do is return back res.status. We can essentially throw an error. We can return back a status of 400, and then we can provide, you know, some sort of message. We can say, hey, message that the user already exists. So the user already exists. So essentially now we wouldn't do any of the other logic that we have before, or we have after this command right over here, if our user exists. Now, if our user doesn't exist, essentially now what we can do is we can go ahead and create that user. So we can do something like const new user, and essentially we can say await user, and now we're going to use a new verb or a new method known as create. And you can see here that there's so many different methods that you can use. We have count, we have create, we have create many. There's so many. We're not going to get into all of them, unfortunately, but you can probably figure them out through docs. I'm just going to kind of explain to you how most of them are done. Essentially here, like count allows us to count all of the records, and we can provide certain filters as well in here. Create, we're going to use right now. Create many works very similarly instead, but we provide it with an array. We also can figure out how to delete. We're going to delete through a certain query. I'll show you guys how to delete, update, find, and create, and maybe I'll also show you how to do some of the other things. But yeah, I'm probably not going to cover every single one in this crash course, but I'll try to do my best. So let's go ahead and let's just use the create now. So we're going to do the create. And now, let's say we want to create, so we provide it with an object, and then over here we create it with data. So we have data, and over here we specify the data that we want to include in here. Now right here, if you remember, if you go back to our studio, really all the data that we need to provide is the username. So we can essentially say that, hey, we want to provide the username of, well, the username that was provided in the rec.body. We can just simplify that down to simply username. And now the absolute last thing that we can do is we can go ahead and just res.json the new user. So we can go ahead and save that. And let's go ahead and let's actually create this right over here. Let's paste that in there. I'm just not sure why that's, oh, sorry. There we go. So let's go new user. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and let's create this new user. Let's actually just change the name to something else. Let's change the name to LeBron. So this is going to be a new user. We're going to create that user. You can see here that it has created the ID and it has also created the username. If for some reason we also don't want that, we can also use the select and specifically select for what we want. So we can either select for the ID or for the username, or for both. Now, if we leave it default, if you don't have that select option, it just selects for everything. So now that actually has been created inside of our database, and we can actually see that through the GUI. So if I refresh the GUI, you can see here that we have 2 records. And to further prove that to you, if I open up Workbench, so if I open up Workbench, which is our actual database, and I did something like select star from users, or from user, and I execute this, you can see here, again, very, very small, I apologize, but there's 2 records, and LeBron is actually one of the records. So that is, well, pretty much it. And next section, let's actually go on and let's create our post routes, which will be a little bit more complicated, but they're going to be more involved, and I'm going to introduce a lot of the methods associated with the Prisma client. So let's do that next. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish off our project by creating the post routes. Now, before we do that, I think you guys might be a little bit confused as to how I got these methods over here. Now really how I got these methods was I used the Prisma client, I appended the dot, and I kind of figured out, hey, all of the methods that are associated with this object right over here. So let's say you wanted to delete something, you would go ahead and just do user dot, and then, well, you would look at it and you'd say, okay, well, delete or delete many. Now let's say you select delete many, but then you have really no idea what goes inside of this parameter. One thing that you could do is just hover over it, and this could give you the type definition. So you can see here the arguments is select, include, and where. Now if that still doesn't make much sense to you, what you could do is just go to the documentation. And I highly suggest this because I will not be able to cover all of the different methods in this crash course because I don't want this to be too long. So just go to the documentation, and you can see here this has all of the commands that we are going to be performing, all of the CRUD commands. So for instance, if you want to create something, over here you can see to create a single record, you can see, well, we already did this, but you can actually see how the data looks like. If you want to create multiple records, well, this is how it's going to look like. Instead of passing in an object, you pass in an array of objects. And if you want to create a record, and I don't know what this is, but yeah, so this is how you do and perform all of these different things. So this is reading right here. If you want to go ahead and update, so if you want to update a single record, well, you would use user.update, and then you would provide a filter, and then this is how you would go ahead and update it. If you want to, update multiple records, update or create a record, so this is probably upsert over here. So you just read the documentation if you really want to kind of fine tune what you want to use. I won't be covering everything. I just want to be able for you to actually be comfortable with Prisma and just use it so that you can actually read the documentation and use whatever it is that you want. So the last thing that we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and we're going to create our post routes. So let us get rid of that. So we're done with the users route. Let's get rid of all of these. So over here in our route, let's just create posts. We're going to call this post just to be consistent. And we're going to have the same kind of boilerplate. So over here, we're just going to import all of this, and we're going to export our router. So let's go ahead and export our router. And then in here, what we are going to do is we're going to create our first route. And now let our first route be a post request to actually create a post. So we're going to do route.post, and then this is going to be, well, the root directory inside of the directory that we specified. And then we're going to have res. As you can imagine, this is going to be asynchronous, so might as well have the async keyword. So the absolute last thing we have to do is inside of our index.js, we have to let our Express server know about this. So we would just say API, and we change this to /post, and we would just change the route to, or the path to post. Okay, cool. So now we can go ahead and actually create our post. Now to create our post, what we have to do is we have to create a post and associate it to a particular person. So remember, a post cannot be created without a person. So because a post has a many-to-one relationship with an individual. So in the rec.body, not only do you have to provide us with, let's go to Studio right now, not only do you have to provide us with the title and the post, but you also have to provide us with the user ID. And for some reason, oh, here we go. Now I can scroll. So you also have to provide us with the user ID. The created at and the updated at, we don't have to worry about that because it is going to be auto-generated. The ID also will be auto-generated, and the user is going to be essentially created based on the user ID that we have over here. So we have two users now. Let's say LeBron made a post, and so we're going to basically pass in the ID of 2. Okay, let's do that right now. So essentially we need the title of the post, we also need the content, and we also need the user ID. All right, so that is, we're getting that from the request body. That the front end is responsible for adding that in the request body. And now what we want to do is we want to first check if the user even exists. So we want to check if, hey, this user ID is actually associated to a real user, because we don't want to add basically we don't want to add a user ID that is actually not associated with the user. And it actually won't be possible because we have our foreign key constraint. So let's actually just check that over here. So how do we check that? Well, we can just say something very similar, const user exists. We kind of did this already. So we can say const user exists, and we can say user dot find unique. And then we can say, well, we are going to find unique by the ID, and we're going to pass in the user ID. So that is essentially what we are going to do. Now remember, if this user does not exist, it is going to return null. So we're going to say, hey, if this user does not exist, what we are going to do is we're going to return res.status of 400. And we're going to provide a message of, user not found. User not found. That is what we are going to do. So that's just a quick little check. Now, if the user actually ends up existing, now what we can do is we can actually create a post. So we can say const new post, and that is going to be await. And now what we want to do is we want to use the Prisma Client, but this time we want to extract the post from it. So now what we can say is await post, and now we can basically say create. Now remember, we can have multiple things, create many. Remember, if you want to use create many, for instance, go ahead and read the docs. Essentially, it's the same as create, but instead of passing in an object, we pass in an array of objects. So over here, we would do create, and let's just go through the docs one more time, just to kind of explain to you how I would typically do this. I want to create a single record, so it's going to be .create, and I'm going to pass in the data through this data object. So let's do that right now. So data, and then over here, we're going to provide the title, the content, as well as the user ID. So we're going to provide the title, the content, and the user ID. All right, so that is creating it, and let's actually go ahead and send that back. So let's do JSON, res.json, and we're going to return that back. All right, so let's go ahead and save this really quick, and let's go to over here and let's create a brand new request. Let's copy this, and we're going to save this. We're going to save that. We're going to change this to create post. We're going to make this a post request. And now what we can do here is inside of our body, we could add our content. And one thing that you could possibly do is more validation. So right now we're only validating our user if they exist, but we're not even validating if the title exists, or if the content exists, or if the title is of a certain length. So that's like increased validation that you can probably do later on in the future. So yeah, so you can probably do that with like Express Validator or something. But for this crash course, who cares? So let's provide a title, and this is going to be a title of this crash course sucks. The content is this instructor is so bad, please dislike and don't sub. So this is a hater, and then the user ID is going to be 2. Remember, the user ID is going to be a user inside of our actual table. So LeBron is saying this to me for some reason. Okay, so we can go ahead and we can execute this, and it is failing. Let's wonder what the error is. Let's see here. So I had a few errors. Most of them were just syntactical errors, but in case you were following along, essentially the first thing was over here, I didn't provide the where condition. So essentially I went ahead and I just did this over here, and my condition was inside of this main object. That's not allowed in Prisma. That's not the correct syntax. We actually have to provide a where object, and in here we provide our condition. The reason for this is because we could have multiple things like select as well in there. So that is the first problem. The other problem is over here, I assumed that the column name was content by accident, but it's actually post. So over here, instead of doing a direct mapping, it's just mapping post to content. And the last little error that I had was this was actually /users and not /posts. So, or sorry, it was /users and not /posts. So I went ahead and I changed it to /post. So now if I go ahead and I actually create this, you can go ahead, you can see that our data has been created. If you go to Studio, which is a reflection of our database, you can refresh this. And you can see that this has been created. And what's great about it is now if I go to users and I, well, it is refreshing, give it some time to refresh, you can see here that LeBron actually has one post, and you can see what that post is. And now if I actually go back to the get users route where we have an array of objects as the posts, over here if I send off this request again, I can see all of LeBron's posts. Alright, so that is terrific. Let's work on one more route, and this route is simply going to be, well, just fetching all of the posts associated to a user. So let's say you go to a user's account and you want to fetch all the posts. Let's go do that right now. So let's say this is going to be a router.get because we want to get all of the posts. And everything so far we have been doing in the rec.body, but let's say for now the user ID is supplied in the params. Just to change things up a little bit. So we have rec res. And then what we are going to do is we in here are going to fetch all of the posts associated to a particular user. Now to do this, it is very simple. We can just do something like const posts, and we can await, and then we can say post.find many. So over here we're going to find many, and so we're going to do find many, and then in here we are going to basically supply it with, well, everything that we need. So we're going to say the where clause. So where the where clause is the user ID is equal to the user ID that we have supplied. Now to be able to access that, well, we can do that very similarly like we did with the rec.body, but instead this is going to be rec.params. And we're going to access the user ID. Now one thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is going to be the string. It's not going to be an actual integer. So we actually have to parse int this right over here so we don't get any sort of error. Now the next thing we can possibly do is select for what we want. So let's say I am going to select for, well, the title. We're going to mark that as true. Let's say the created at. If you want everything, you don't have to include this select for. Now, so let's say you want the title. Let's say you want the post as well, of course. So that will be true. And let's say you also want the user, and you want all the information associated to the user. So you can say true to that. So now what we can do is very, very simply just go ahead and return all of the posts. And now let's go ahead and test that out in Postman. So let's create a brand new request, and we're going to call this get posts by user. So let's go here, and in the param we're going to provide the ID. So we're going to do 2 for LeBron. And now if I go ahead and I send this off, I get